Okay, this is an interesting study that just came out, and it has an optimistic message that if we implement the nationally determined contributions and long-term targets for low emission developments by all the uh, signatories of the Paris Agreement who updated their NDCs by COP26, then there is a fair bit of chance of not exceeding 2 degrees C and staying under 2 degrees C, even though 1.5 degrees C seems quite impossible with the current targets and NDCs and long-term plans. So I wanted to include it. There is lots of bottom-up calculations involved. The figures are quite complicated, but I'll just give you a gist of the main ideas, and we will end with their paper's suggestions on how additional actions may take us below 1.5 degrees C. So just remember the optimistic message that if countries that have been so keen on participating in this global negotiation process and submitted plans and updated plans, if they all implement these plans, then we can still make it to staying under 2 degrees C. Okay, so here we are looking at number of countries that have nationally determined contributions, long-term targets and net zero emission targets, and their share of global CO2 emissions. So here is the share of global CO2 emissions as of 2020, excluding land use change contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. So we are looking also at the number of countries. So the first NDCs under Paris Agreement were submitted by almost all countries, and then majority have submitted new or updated nationally determined contributions. So the democratic process of submitting voluntary targets has worked, and of course there is the monitoring, verification and reporting phase that has to start soon, I think in 2023. And if the countries stick to their will to do this, then obviously we will make progress. So the majority submitted new or updated NDCs. 76 countries plus the 27 EU as a whole have long-term targets that are part of either NDCs or long-term low emission development plans, and 44 plus the EU 27 have long-term low emission development plans. Okay, so you can see here that the countries that have submitted NDCs cover almost all of the emissions, and then the new and updated NDCs number of countries is quite high, similar to the number that have been involved in submitting NDCs, and they cover over 75% of the total emissions. And then there are countries with long-term targets. When you take NDCs and long-term low emission development plans, that number of countries is fair bit, including EU, and the amount of share of global CO2 goes down there. Obviously keeps going down this way, but when you look at long-term countries that actually already have long-term strategy for low emission developments, that number is fair bit as well, but they cover a smaller fraction of the global share. And there are countries now which are announcing net zero emission targets, which have, some of them have policies in process, which is very critical. They cover a fair bit of, so more than 25% of the global share of CO2 emissions, and there are many that have targets in law, and that's a much smaller number, and announced targets are here with their share and the number of countries. So overall the process is working. The caption for the next figure, which is a bit complicated, is here. Although some near-term pledges are estimated to be very weak, implying potentially substantial overachievement, what is called hot air here. I have some breeze coming, so I'll see how bad the rustling sound is in the recording and then redo it if necessary. But again, this is a reminder that I'm desperately trying not to use the air conditioner in Mumbai with temperatures really hot, humidity very high. Okay, so in other words, if you look at the country level emissions and their NDCs and lack of policies to head there and so on, you end up with an estimated overachievement, which is called hot air. I think some of you know what typically we mean when we say hot air. Nature cannot publish bullshit, but basically it means bullshit in that sense. But countries are trying, so we don't want to say they are bullshitting. Nonetheless, we have to keep an eye on where they are in their emissions and what they claim about their pledges, right? So countries with long-term targets envisage substantial per capita emissions reductions. So let's look at these some of these numbers where we are looking at per capita greenhouse gas emissions, excluding again land use, land change, and global warming potential over 100 years, according to as per AR6 has been done to convert to tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This includes international maritime transport and bunkers, in other words, all the supply of fuels to all ships across the globe, divided by the population, so it stays down here. But you can see when you look at per capita, these are the numbers we have already seen before. India total contribution is, so you can look at total emissions in million ton CO2 equivalent per year in these sizes of circles, and they come with error bars here as well. So the color shading includes high income, upper middle income, lower middle income here, for example, and some low incomes and the maritime bunkers. Okay, so obviously India is down here, Indonesia, China has creeped up into this level beyond UK and so on, which is here at about 6 ton CO2 per capita per year. So the total contribution is large as well because of the population. USA, Saudi Arabia, Australia up here, Turkmenistan and Palau show up here as well in this bottom up calculation, and the scale stops here, but you have some countries beyond that, as you can see here. So this is in 2019. Where will we be in 2030? So again, India goes up, total contribution goes up, and you have several countries here, Japan, UK, Italy, Brazil. So Brazil has gone up again. China, with its targets, long-term low emission development plans and so on, goes up a little, and total contribution remains almost the same. USA comes down here substantially if it implements all its plan. Saudi Arabia comes down as well, and so on. So 76 countries with long-term targets in their nationally determined contributions or long-term low emission development plans, and India's 1st November 2021 announcement of net zero targets are spread over here. So India is at 2070, China at 2060, US at 2050, I think, and New Zealand, Canada, other countries are down here. So the hot air are for unconditional 2030 NDCs higher than reference. You remember, unconditional is something countries will do for their nationally determined contributions as submitted. Conditional is when some things will not be done unless international finance and other assistance is provided for implementing those NDCs. So depending on the mapping done with SSP 5, SSP 1, you remember those we have looked at before, which include socioeconomic choices on adaptation and mitigation. So Pakistan's hot air is quite large in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in million ton CO2 equivalent. Turkey, Vietnam, and so on. Other countries with large uncertainties, but you can see that many of these low income, low or developing countries have overestimation of their accomplishments according if you look at their emissions and their NDCs. Okay, the next figure is about global mean temperature projections based on 2030 NDCs, showing a wide range, whereas those based also on long-term targets stay just around or below 2 degrees C. So you can look at exceedance probabilities in this case with additional effects by the global methane pledges, which just got agreed upon. So this paper does two scenarios, sensitivity case considering full implementation of NDC targets in A and only unconditional targets in B, so only those that countries would do anyways. Okay, and there are lots of details here that I won't go into, but I will just summarize this way. So global mean surface temperature relative to 1850 to 1900, 1.5 is here, 2 degrees C is here, and exceedance probabilities are shown here. And there are other studies which have been done before which talk about various levels of exceedances. SSP2 4.5 is kind of the middle of the road here. SSP1 2.6 will keep us below 2, and SSP1 1.9 will keep us below 1.5. But focusing back on NDCs, this calculation in this paper argues that we have a fair chance of staying below 2 degrees C, with other studies providing a range over here, and the probability of exceeding 1.5 is pretty high in this calculation in this paper, whereas the probability of staying under 2 degrees C is as high as 50%. So exceedance probability is 50%. So that's the good news. And then there are details like greenhouse gas emissions, methane emissions, and global mean surface temperatures, where we are and where this study lands up. And these are median. So this is different details. This is with respect to 1850 to 1900, with scenario A here and the other studies compared here, other comparable studies based on 2030 NDCs. So extrapolation is done from 2030 to 2100. Basically, the idea is that the cumulative emissions where we were historically and where we can end up by 2030 with respect to 2020 and 2050 with respect to 2020, and looking at various countries including international shipping and so on, and where unconditional NDCs would bring us, and where full implementation of NDCs would bring us. So the idea is that by 2030 or 2050, we can stay on target for cumulative emissions to keep warming below 2 degrees centigrade with a 67% probability. Okay, this is a similar figure looking at 2030 emissions with respect to 2025 and 2050 peak median warming in 21st century relative to 1850 to 1900. As I said, the figures are a bit complicated, and there are the captions. The main message I would want to leave with is, depending on how the implementation happens by 2030 relative to 2025 in million ton CO2 equivalent, there are plenty of opportunities to peak properly to hit our 2 degrees C target with a fair bit of chance if we implement all the NDCs. So various contributions by countries pulling down their emissions are shown here. So these are historical emissions, and 2022 is still underway. So if India and China hit these kind of numbers, then definitely we are headed to below 2 degrees C. Good news, right, overall? So in the end, limiting peak or 2100 warming to 1.5 degrees C is dependent on four main pillars. First, existing long-term pledges and targets need to be underpinned by policies and measures during this decade. So we are falling behind in terms of announcing various NDCs but not having the policy tools and other measures like investments in renewable, meeting the targets on additional carbon sinks and so on being implemented already. Secondly, emission reduction targets this decade need to be substantially enhanced to reduce CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 and to decisively reduce non-CO2 emissions. So CO2 equivalent is a good way to look at it, because if we focus on net zero CO2 and don't track the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, we could get in trouble, especially for the 1.5 degree C target and also for 2 degree C. Third, countries without net zero targets should consider announcing and implementing such targets with appropriate support in the case of low-income countries where the conditional and unconditional implementations come in. Finally, countries with net zero targets could bring their net zero dates forward or aim for net negative targets. Commitments made so far, especially for this decade, fall far short of what is required to limit temperature rise to 1.5 C. So we are in the current trajectory of everything, even in the best case scenario, we are blowing past 1.5 degrees C with a high probability, unless a game changer comes along, as I always say. Any delay in reversing the upward trend of emissions, phasing out the unabated use of fossil fuels, and developing sustainable, additional, and permanent negative emission options will put this target out of reach. Okay, so kind of longish here, doesn't matter, but I wanted to just leave this podcast for you to listen to, and then you can read the details if you are more seriously interested in the way the calculations are done. But I like optimistic messages. As the saying goes, people's belief in predictions and projections depends on how much they believe the predictions, how much they want the predictions and projections to come true. I want optimistic scenarios to come true, so I always try to focus on them. So when I look at people who always give huge negative messages of how we are losing time and we are going to be beyond a point of return in 7 years, 13 years, and so on and so on. Various numbers are thrown around based on the remaining carbon budget and the emission rates and so on. I hope they are not thinking that the projections will come true if they keep saying negative messages. I don't want to blame anybody, but I just am not a big fan of constant negative messaging, especially because now it is very clear that mental health issues, just based on what's happening and what is projected to happen and how it is messaged, is a serious problem now, especially for young people. So we must project a optimistic vision of the future based on what is already available and how we are working together to accomplish these goals. Okay, some philosophy there, but let me leave it there.